say 95% of the time, a piece of property was sold on the courthouse square. Cameron bought it. It was, I don't know why, but he managed to have the highest bid and got the property. So he eventually owned a lot of property here in Pike County. He started a rumor that the Rainey Opera House was not secure, was not a safe place to go, that the building was shaky, and that if you went upstairs to any event in that upstairs auditorium, the floor might fall in. Needless to say, Rainey did not stay in business much after Cameron opened his opera house. The King Opera House, which is, I have to get my bearings where I am right now, 2 blocks east of us, opened in the 1890s. It burned, I think, 3 times, and each time they built it back, it was very elegant. They went to New York to buy the sets for the performances. They had vaudeville come in. They came in on the train up here at the Katy Depot. They stayed at the Beckham Hotel, and they then performed. That one, Virginia King kept the King Opera House open after her husband died. And by 1917, when the United States entered World War I, it had to stop. Railroads at that time were nationalized, and the federal government said, we need trains for running war material, moving troops, and we don't have time or space to take these vaudeville players all across the country. So the King then turned into a motion picture theater. In 1919, after the war was over, there was a push for a memorial auditorium here in Greenville. But it was followed by an economic downturn. So the idea was still there. It was hatched in 1919, but there were several reasons why it wasn't done at that time. First of all, people said, well, the Carnegie Library has a auditorium on the 2nd floor, but they neglected to remember that the Women's Federation of City Federation of Women's Club had the sole lease on that auditorium. So unless you were a club woman, you couldn't meet there. The First Presbyterian Church, which was, if you remember, it was over here on Jordan and Wesley, great building. Unfortunately, they let it just kind of fall apart. It had a huge sanctuary, as did Kavanaugh over on Park Street. But that wasn't an appropriate place for some programs that would be held here in Greenville. The King, as I mentioned, was being transformed into a motion picture theater. The courthouse, the old one before the one we have today, had been used for meetings in the courtroom, but the county was getting ready to build a new courthouse, and so that wasn't a successful one. And finally, they considered the Chautauqua tent that was used every summer for Chautauqua programs. But who wants to go sit in a tent in December? So there was no real place to meet. And in fact, in 1930, the city offices were over down the street a bit at the Beckham Annex. The city rented office space in the Beckham Annex for their officials. They only had 2 people on the city council. There was the mayor and 2 city commissioners. But they didn't have an office, no tax office. It was all in the Beckham Annex. The jail, Greenville leased space from the county to hold their prisoners. And the old fire station that was on Pickett and Johnson. Okay, I was mixed up thinking. The one that had that wonderful arch over it. It was still in use in the 30s. So Greenville, at the beginning during the Depression, cotton had dropped to a nickel a pound. Very, very hard time here. But there still was an interest in a municipal building and auditorium. In June of 1933, right after Franklin Roosevelt became president, the National Industrial Recovery Act was passed. This was an act it was kind of like a stimulus. We had a stimulus under Obama. Well, now they had a stimulus then. And they formed the Public Works Administration Project. It was an overall public works, which meant city halls, municipal auditoriums, libraries, colleges, college dormitories, railroad stations, dams, all of these type of things that would add to the betterment of a town or a community. There were 34,000 projects covered by this in the United States between 1933 and 1939. In 1933, Greenville sent in an application. William R. Ragsdale was the architect, and if you stop to think about it, what other building in town did Ragsdale design? Any ideas? They look alike. The courthouse. He had designed the courthouse in 1928 associated with Page Brothers, an architectural company in Austin, known for building courthouses. The one we have was the prototype of the Travis County Courthouse, still in use today in Austin. So if you look at the two buildings, you have that white limestone. The courthouse is a little bit more older architectural style, but look at them sometime. When you come up over the overpass on Johnson Street, look at both of them. You can see both of them there, and there is a similarity in those two buildings. The PWA, Public Works Administration, was based on grants and loans. The federal government gave 45% of the cost of the building in a grant, and the city or the entity, public entity, was responsible for paying back the remaining 55%. Now, when the first one came out, the committee here in Greenville decided that they would offer to lease the building instead of repaying the 55% on the cost. The federal government had no intentions of leasing out property to communities, and so by the time all this was negotiated, Greenville had run out of time and got beat out on the draw. But they used the same, would later use the same application. The application itself that was submitted in 33 and then later in 38 emphasized Greenville as a market, railroad, and education center for Hunt County and the surrounding areas. And when you look at the railroad maps, you can see that they all kind of came together here. We had 2 colleges at that time. Vidal had moved into Oklahoma, but we had Wesley and Burleson. It was the estimated trade population was 150,000. And one of the greatest assets would be an auditorium, because within the trade district, the trade area, there was no public venue for entertainment. The new building would house all city offices, police, fire, health, corporate law, or corporation court, and 2 military militia units, plus the jail. In 1937, the PWA was activated again, and Greenville met the criteria this time. They decided, they agreed to the 55% payback. 10,000 applications submitted to the federal government, 7,000 were approved, and one of those was from the city of Greenville. There was an overwhelming support for this here in Greenville. There was no, people had to vote to accept this contract. There was no campaign. But let's think about who the voters were. First of all, they said, we can pay this back with revenue from the power plant. We can generate our own power, on electricity. We can use that funding to build this building. But what did you have to do to get to vote in the late 1930s? And I know some of you still did it when you voted for the first time when you were 21. Pay your poll tax. Did everybody pay poll tax? No. In the Depression, only people with extra money spent that $1.50 to pay poll tax. So you had, the city was guaranteeing repayment, and only people who were fairly wealthy were going to vote. So it was not a big deal about was it going to pass. It passed real quickly. But it was passed on the confidentially that there would be no tax increase. And of course that always makes people happy. The lot that the city municipal building is on was owned by the heirs of A.S. Marshall. He was a former county clerk, and the family sold it for $6,000. The municipal building itself is considered Art Deco with some modern adornments. Actually, the modern movement was created in Germany at the end of World War I to rebuild all those towns that were bombed during the war. The building included 2 jails, one on top of the other, just like it is down in the courthouse. The women were on top, the men were down in the bottom, and both of those jails were segregated. In one of them, in the men's jail, down in the lower part, there is etched into the steel wall a saying that says, Lord, please don't let them take me to TDC. And it is still there today. The jails are now being used for storage. The cost was under $150,000 plus the $6,000 for the loan, for the lot. It was paid off with, not including the loan, but the whole thing was $150,000. The people were paid off on September the 27th, 1939. The building was accepted on 9th of October, and on the 24th of October, 1939, the city municipal building was open, had an open house. And the members of the Flaming Flashes served as tour guides throughout the ceremony. And let me tell you, people who are of that age, none of us are. I almost started running when they saw me coming because I was going to ask them, what do you remember about this? The thing that I got out of most people that I talked to was, if you realize that the City Hall Municipal Building is next door to the old Safeway. And what was at the Safeway before Safeway was there?
High school.
The high school. It had been turned into a junior high, and the high school was down where whatever number post office that is that's not used today. I interviewed several people who I said, what do you remember about that? And Troy has a wonderful movie that film went with. Was that Walter Shank's father that
Yes.
took the?
The construction of the,
Right.
it's very short,
Very
like
short,
30
very
seconds.
brief, but it gives you this awesome photograph of the bones of the
Yep.
building. But anyhow, I talked to Jack Horton, and I talked to Mary Powell, and I talked to a couple of other people, and they said that when they were on the east side of the old high school in the junior high building, that they did not learn one thing that year. Because they could, and Jack Horton could give me a very, very explicit details of how that guy would catch those rivets in this funnel-like thing, and then put them into the steel beams. Thank goodness they didn't have to take those tests. The building was opened on Tuesday, the 24th. On Thursday, the 29th, was the first concert. Now, I know most of you remember going to concerts and musical things that were a little less formal. But the first one was a recital by Mac Harrell, who was a former resident of Greenville. He was a Celeste native, and he had just recently acquired a contract with the Metropolitan Opera Company of New York City. He performed a recital of German lieder music. And the reason I keep bringing up German and Germany is that this happened 6 weeks after Hitler marched into Poland. The United States was beginning to be aware of problems in Europe. It wasn't as personal to us at that point as it was to Europeans. But the fact that he did a complete concert of German music, I thought was very interesting. At that time, the Greenville Cooperative Concert Committee chose the programs. And the programs could be civic programs, they could be dance recitals. I asked lots and lots and lots of women, and I may have asked some of you, what do you remember about the Greenville Municipal Auditorium? And they said dance recitals. How many of you were in a dance recital over there? Right. Even James.
No, I sang.
Oh, good.
I didn't dance.
You didn't whistle?
No, jump on drums. But I knew the dancers. We had some lovely dancers.
During World War II, big bands were here. And Dr. Atkinson told me that one time when he came back from A&M for a holiday or something, there was a big band playing, and it was being broadcast to North Africa over the Armed Forces radio system. The most interesting, to me, a very interesting thing I learned was that out at Majors Field, which was also a federally funded place, they had decided that there would be a group, and I'm not for sure what the Army Air Corps called their groups, but they would have I guess it was like a company. And they were all men who were professional musicians. They had to know how to play classical music, they had to know how to play military march music, they had to know how to play swing and jazz, and they had to know how to play country music. So they were very versatile musicians, and that's all they did. Their group was called the Wings of Swing, and they traveled all over the United States to sell or to help promote bonds, Liberty bonds. But they were stationed here at Majors Field, and they performed in the auditorium many times and were actually broadcast over the Armed Forces radio system. After the war, the Louisiana Hayride became the big player. Any of you go to any of that Louisiana Hayride? You're too young. The Louisiana Hayride originated over in Shreveport. It was kind of a takeoff on the Grand Ole Opry. The Grand Ole Opry had established itself early in the 20th century. The Louisiana Hayride was kind of a new kid on the block after the war. They had a wonderful auditorium there in Shreveport. People came in to visit, and that was their reason. But they also decided, as a marketing ploy, to send out these unknown musicians through East Texas all the way to Dallas, southeast Oklahoma, southern Arkansas, into Missouri, into Mississippi, although they did compete with the Grand Ole Opry in Mississippi, and throughout the northern part of Louisiana. So the Louisiana Hayride performed regularly here in Greenville. They also performed over at the Sportatorium in Dallas. And so the two venues were very similar. We were competing with the Dallas venue. Who was the most famous Louisiana Hayride performer? Elvis. Yes. And he actually came here twice. Once on his own and once as part of the Louisiana Hayride. There were also regional promoters. They would get together, a group of musicians, and tour. They would go to Bonham, they'd go to Sulphur. They didn't go to Sulphur Springs. They actually went to Riley Springs. They came here, and there was a group of promoters from Dallas. One of them was named Hal Horton, not Woodkern's grandfather, not Jack's brother-in-law, but, no, Jack's father. But Mr. Horton and another guy were DJs on a radio station over in Dallas, and they decided that they were going to have the first women's fiddlers contest. Now, there was supposedly something about some kind of a myth or belief that women could not play a fiddle. I don't play a fiddle, but that's beside the point. And so they were going to host the first women's fiddler contest, and they held it here in Greenville at the Municipal Auditorium. The winner was Ruby Allman from Bailey, Texas. And this year, and I'm not on the Main Street, Friends of Main Street board, but I understand that there is to be a fiddling contest by the Libby sisters.
Bob Wills.
Bob Wills. And that they got the idea of this from Ruby Allman winning that contest. And Commerce, the library, the archives at Commerce at the university has some great collections of her photographs and things. Ruby Allman was typical of rural people during the Depression who didn't come to town. They stayed home and they worked the fields 6 days a week, and when they had any time off, they created their own music. Many rural farm families had very talented musicians, and Ruby Allman was one of those. Another funny story that I just love about the auditorium has to do with Victor Borga. Remember who Victor Borga was? He was a pianist. Did you see? You may have been there. And he was up there on the stage performing, and he was a comedian and an excellent pianist. And all of a sudden, there's this voice comes out and says something to him, and he hollers back at him. And they have this conversation going on while he's on the stage, and there's this other person, this man, with kind of a slurred voice, hollering back at him. Where was the man? Do you know? He was in the jail. They had a drunk down in the jail who was heckling Victor Borga, and Borga took it up and made a great performance out of it. The auditorium was well known for its outstanding acoustics, and it still is to this day. So because of those outstanding acoustics, they got better quality shows here than, say, at Riley Springs or Bonham. Not to put down Riley Springs or Bonham, but the coordination of the entertainment that's been over there, Larry Green Jr. wanted me to find out everybody who had ever performed at the Municipal Auditorium, and I told him he couldn't afford it. But I did come up, he said, well, how did they get the acts going? And I do have a kind of a family tree on this. It started out prior to, at the very beginning, it was the Greenville Cooperative Concert Committee of the City Federation of Women's Clubs. Now, if you are not familiar with the City Federation of Women's Clubs, and maybe some of your mothers were members, they had a lot to do with the cultural events in Greenville. They made sure that the library was here, and they took over and made sure that we had quality performances. In fact, in 1953, they invited a young pianist from Tyler to perform. His name was Van Cliburn, and 5 years later he would win the contest in Moscow. After the war, the area community concerts took over the booking of performances, and they did a very good job. They still allowed school performances, band concerts, dance recitals, but they also brought in other acts. In 1968, the Greenville Entertainment Series was created, and Harris Morgan was very, very important in the Greenville Entertainment Series, as well as the Dallas Symphony Series 7 years later. And finally, in 2003, the Kenneth Threadgill series was created, and many of you probably have been to the Threadgill concert. However, I must tell you that you may not realize this, but Kenneth Threadgill, for whom the series is named, was a Greenville native. He was born here in the late 1890s, and he was a professor at Pinal University, which later became Texas Holiness University out of Pinal. Now, those people in Pinal had some very strong beliefs. One of their beliefs was that there would be no card playing, no alcohol, no smoking, something else. And so it was written into their property deeds that if you were found with card games in your house, you could lose your property. Nobody ever really tried that, and so it didn't go up. I don't know if the courts would have held that up or not, but it was in the deeds. When the streetcar that used to run through town went to Pinal, there had to be a separate car to Pinal so that it did not advertise alcohol or smoking. Very serious people. Now, Kenneth Threadgill had a son whose name was Kenneth also, and he did not follow his father's footsteps. He did not follow in his father's religious beliefs. He went to Austin and set up a tavern called Threadgill's, and he did a lot of musical, helped a lot of musicians. Janis Joplin. All of a sudden her name just, Janis Joplin was one of his
Christmas songs.
yeah. All these played in, down in Austin. When the group organizing the Threadgill concert decided on a name, they chose Kenneth Threadgill because he was from Pinal and had a Greenville connection. I've always thought it was very ironic. I don't know myself. Thank you very much. You have any questions?